If you've been on the internet for any amount of time, I bet at some point you've come across an internet aesthetic. Whether that be vaporwave or something more obscure like synthwave. By those examples alone, you probably understand what an internet aesthetic is. They are ways of expressing art in a way that is exclusive to what the aesthetic is all about. These aesthetics can range from images to videos to how people dress. We have all come across these different forms of artistic representation at some point. This can also extend to images that take inspiration from the past, things like the old internet. Aesthetics like nostalgiacore do this well, but there is one that sticks out, an aesthetic that is almost in a league of its own with how absurd it is. It's an aesthetic so weird it's literally in the name. I am of course referring to Weirdcore. Weirdcore is an aesthetic that is so different from others, it's hard to even call it an aesthetic because it's just so absurd. Weirdcore images are a blend of uncanny, nostalgic, and unsettling. They are like liminal spaces in that way. Speaking of liminal spaces, a lot of Weirdcore images depict liminal spaces. Liminal spaces are transitional spaces that evoke nostalgia or can unsettle you. The use of liminal spaces contributes to the overall unfamiliarity and nostalgia of Weirdcore images. Now, I realize I've been using the word Weirdcore a lot, but I haven't really defined it yet. That's because there really isn't a solid definition for what constitutes as a Weirdcore image. But I bet just by the images that are on screen right now, you could probably get a basic idea. They are images that seem to play off of nostalgia. A lot of them are reminiscent of the early internet with their weird borders, bad camera quality, crudely edited visuals, or word art style text. They have an almost dreamlike quality to them. A lot of them are in high saturation, or depict images from a time kids born between the late 90s and early 2000s grew up in and would remember. They are images of places with non-existent context, faced with problems and objects that don't make any sense. Oftentimes with supporting text that only acts to make the contextless image even more confusing, with either text that doesn't make sense, is structured poorly, or doesn't fit in with the context of the image. The term Weirdcore was only really coined in 2020, yet the aesthetics of Weirdcore have existed far before then. The old internet is a good example of this. Things like wordplay text and low-quality images ran rampant in the early internet. The aesthetic goes way beyond what it was based on, however. Weirdcore games like LSD Dream Emulator came out in the 90s, far before the term Weirdcore was ever coined, but the elements of Weirdcore are clearly present. A good Weirdcore image feels almost like a dream. This can be both comforting or discomforting. Sometimes the dream can be happy, like a blissful fever dream you had as a child. Or maybe it's a little discomforting, like things being labeled what they aren't, or black boxes that seemingly block out something so disturbing that you aren't even allowed to see it. The thing they all share though is these seemingly random captions. I touched on them a bit earlier. They can range from asking a question, making a bizarre statement, or giving you a choice. They can also be scary, giving you a subtle, disturbing undertone. What's interesting about the text is that it's never clear who's talking. Sometimes they feel like us, like we're talking to ourselves or thinking. Sometimes, however, it feels like someone else is doing the thinking for us. The text can also warn you about things, telling you to not look in certain places or highlighting danger or even highlighting something safe. Another thing that can make Weirdcore images feel the way they do is objects in the wrong place or wrong context. The sky and the pool water being swapped in this image, for example, or the outside being engulfed in a bright blue. This further reinforces the dreamlike feeling. Images of bridges or stairwells leading to sky, or a room opening up to reveal outer space. Naturally, in a dream, your brain can't fill in all the gaps. Some things have to be missing, and Weirdcore images perfectly describe these missing pieces. Almost like the world your brain creates isn't one-to-one with reality, and it becomes very obvious when you choose to focus on it, an uncanny reality between the conscious and the subconscious. Looking at Weirdcore images is like visiting a place your mind has not yet constructed in a dream. Dreamcore is another aesthetic that is very similar to Weirdcore. The main difference being that Dreamcore is supposed to take that slight dreamlike feeling of Weirdcore and make it the entire purpose of the aesthetic. These two are so similar that it's hard to differentiate them sometimes. The biggest differentiator between Weirdcore and Dreamcore is the nostalgia you feel when looking at Weirdcore images. The aesthetic of the old internet with its cheesy text, odd borders, and low quality makes Weirdcore feel nostalgic. It gives people who grew up in that time a sense of familiarity and nostalgia. but one that is contrasted by the almost unsettling visuals and non-existent context. Weirdcore combines things that people knew and loved from the 2000s and shows them in a different light. They tell us to yearn for a time we can never return to by depicting visuals mostly common in the old internet, taking people back to an earlier era that might have been long forgotten. But instead of looking at it through a lens of a happy yearning for the past, Weirdcore subverses it by tying the qualities of the early internet to something disturbing and uncanny. A censor mark covering something seemingly disturbing clashes heavily with the high saturation, friendly looking environment. Or this play place that for whatever reason has the lights turned off and what looks to be a warning symbol in the corner. But warning you of what? Something Weirdcore does is give you a false sense of security. You are comforted by the visuals of your past only for them to have a disturbing undertone. It's a contradiction that unsettles the viewer. An image reminding you of a comforting past only for that comfort to be subversed with the context of the image is similar to what liminal spaces do, which is another reason why liminal spaces are often depicted in Weirdcore imagery. These images remind people of the early internet, but it's hard to be comforted by that nostalgia because the image contains no cohesion, and in some cases don't even make sense. As I said before, Weirdcore feels very much dreamlike, and as someone who has very vivid dreams, I can confirm this. Weirdcore is like peering into a scary dream. Not exactly a nightmare, but a dream that feels unsettling. Lucid dreaming is when the dreamer knows they're in a dream. I have lucid dreamt before, many times in fact. I used to actively use lucid dreaming techniques to attempt to dream consciously. The thing about dreams is that they aren't really meant to be experienced in this way. You aren't supposed to know you're in a dream. It's only when you wake up that you realize the ridiculousness of the situations you experience in your dreams, which is one reason I think the very concept of lucid dreaming is unsettling. Not because you might end up in a nightmare, because you aren't really supposed to be conscious of or understand the world your brain has created. Onyrophobia is the fear of dreaming. Not to be confused with somnophobia, the fear of nightmares and scary dreams. Onyrophobia is simply the fear of going to sleep and entering a dream. People with onyrophobia not only hate dreaming, but the very concept of a world that isn't real, a world that feels fake. I think Weirdcore images really highlight the creepier sides of dreams. In a dream, your brain can't process everything around it, so some things feel missing. Things like the sky being outside of your door, or an outside that isn't visible from the inside, almost like the outside world isn't fully rendered. Weirdcore takes the unsettling, zero context, no cohesion aspect of our dreams and puts them on full display. I think this is it. I think this is why Weirdcore feels the way it does. You might argue that Dreamcore is the aesthetic that focuses on dreams more than Weirdcore. It's even in the name after all. But I think the main thing that ironically makes Weirdcore feel more dreamlike than Dreamcore is the out-of-context nature of Weirdcore, while Dreamcore tends to focus more on horror. Weirdcore feels more like it lets the viewer of the image decide on their own what to think. The dreamlike aspect of Weirdcore is something that can also be explored in games. LSD Dream Emulator is a game that I mentioned at the start as being an example of a Weirdcore game. What I meant by that is LSD Dream Emulator is a game that, as the title suggests, is a dream emulator. What's interesting is that this isn't an indie game. This is a real game that was one of the couple thousand original games on the PS1. It had marketing, physical copies, and a whole studio behind it. Yet it feels like an experimental indie game, before the term even existed. Dream Emulator doesn't feel like a game, which I think is one of the reasons it was only released in Japan. And don't take my word for it either. The Japanese marketing boldly claims that this is not a game. So, if not a game, what is LSD Dream Emulator? Well, it's a series of rooms, or planes, or villages, or cities, all connected by the only mechanic of the game. Choose to bump into anything at all, and you'll be teleported elsewhere. That's it, that's the gameplay. You walk through walls, explore these weird abstract realities, and when you're done, walk through another wall. After doing this for a few minutes, the game, or more specifically the dream, ends, and you get taken to a screen that shows where you ended up. And then you go back in and repeat. Dream Emulator isn't much of a game at all. You go from place to place and just walk around. The reason Dream Emulator isn't a game is right in the title. It's meant to portray the nature of dreams. Osamu Sato, the creator of Dream Emulator, designed Dream Emulator's world with 10 years of his own dream journal. Everything about this game feels like a dream, including the soundtrack, this weird mesh of sounds that was released alongside Dream Emulator in an album called Lucy in the Sky with Dynamites. Despite not selling very well, it isn't hard to see the effect of Dream Emulator today with other similar dreamlike games. Recently, it got a remake on itch.io, which is the footage you're seeing right now. It's a faithful recreation of the original. I recommend you check it out. And one tip, play this game when you're very tired. I found that the dreamlike feeling is even more present when you can barely keep your eyes open. Which makes sense, because as the promotional material for the game says, this is not a game. And it isn't. LSD Dream Emulator is not a game. LSD Dream Emulator is a dream. And I think this is it. This is the reason why people call this a Weirdcore game. It's a game that feels like a dream. And what other thing feels more like a dream than the aesthetics of Weirdcore? I think the concept of a Weirdcore game is honestly perfect, because Weirdcore itself takes a lot of liberties from earlier games, whether that be in the form of weird UI, icons, or checkpoints. It seems like a game about Weirdcore was almost destined to happen, but as I mentioned before, LSD Dream Emulator came out in the 90s. What was a Weirdcore game doing before the term Weirdcore existed? Well, the truth is, Weirdcore has always been around in some form or another. Even art forms from the past showed signs of Weirdcore, mainly in the Surrealist art movement. The Surrealist movement was popularized by people like Salvador Dali. Surrealist art depicts things that don't make sense, nonsensical paintings made for the unconscious to express itself. The art itself is designed to elicit a sense of discomfort and intrigue by blurring the lines between the conscious and the unconscious, almost like peering into a dream. Sound familiar? I feel like Weirdcore is the modern surrealism, but instead of having to be a skilled painter to make surrealist art, now anybody can make Weirdcore images with any photo editing software. This accessibility and the internet connecting so many like-minded people is sort of the reason Weirdcore exists, and even before Weirdcore, things like cursed images had already existed. Cursed images are bizarre pictures that are seen as unsettling or disturbing, and are often given very little context. Again, sound familiar? Weirdcore can be classified as surrealist works of art, or even cursed images, but I think what sets Weirdcore out from these things is the different auras they portray. While most surrealist paintings invoke a sense of confusion or maybe even a little bit of disturbance, they never really go beyond that. It's the same with cursed images. It seems there's only really one widely accepted definition for what a cursed image can be. However, with Weirdcore, there seems to be different classes of Weirdcore images. While some Weirdcore images can be creepy or even disturbing, I've found that some Weirdcore images have a certain comfort to them. A home-like environment that makes the viewer feel safe in a way. I found that most images that gave me a feeling of safety were also nostalgic, like these images of suburbia, typical in most North American upbringings and can be nostalgic to people who grew up in places like this, giving them a feeling of comfort and a sense of home. Or how about these green rolling hills that are often depicted in Weirdcore imagery? They sort of look like the Bliss default wallpapers on Windows XP computers. And why are people nostalgic about that? Probably because they used Windows XP as children. And therefore, in the vast majority of people, there's a certain comfort in these rolling landscapes. Or the fact that a lot of Weirdcore images are oversaturated and show childlike aesthetics. And why might people be nostalgic about that? Because they match with a lot of children's cartoons from around that time. The comfort of an image is directly correlated to how much nostalgia the image evokes in the viewer. However, this nostalgia can be subversed. Some Weirdcore images can be scary. They depict scenes that are completely dark. They might show a monster or even black out a section of your screen entirely, as if whatever's behind this blacked out void is more terrifying than you can ever imagine. Everything is out of place, and you feel like everything around you is hostile. You feel like you're lost in a place no human is ever supposed to visit, like the out of bounds in a video game. These scarier images are the opposite of the comfortable ones. They don't feel nostalgic, they feel almost otherworldly. But some scarier Weirdcore images can do something even worse. Instead of being plain scary and in a weird place, they instead are set in places you might have visited as a child. They take the nostalgia of the comfortable images and subvert them by making them scary. They depict places in your childhood like playgrounds or a house with early 2000s decor and make them unsettling. Not only does this subvert what you thought you knew about nostalgia's inherent comfort, but it also makes you think about your memories in a different light. What if there was something you didn't notice as a child? Something so disturbing, yet just so out of reach? What if whatever's putting those black boxes over objects is trying to protect you? Something so disturbing that it's simply blocked out. This is the question that disturbing weirdcore images ask. Although, this feeling isn't exclusive to just scary weirdcore images. In fact, most weirdcore images feel disturbing in their own right. Even the comforting ones sometimes feel like a front for something horrible. I feel like all weirdcore images present fear in some way. The fear of the unknown and the unknowable is something every weirdcore image shares, no matter how strange, weird, or even disturbing. Weirdcore forces us to confront a world that shouldn't exist, much like a dream. We shouldn't be focusing on these images. The memories of any dream should fade away. You shouldn't be consciously appreciating dreams, and yet with weirdcore, that's exactly what you're doing. Appreciating weirdcore is important. Weirdcore stimulates our curiosity as humans. It tells us to fear the unknown, but also to take comfort in our past. This way of thinking has existed far before weirdcore was ever a thing, and for good reason. Weirdcore feels like an evolution of art forms like surrealism and even cursed images. Even weirdcore games have existed far before weirdcore was ever a thing. Weirdcore has a meaning that is impossible to understand, and I think that's the point. You feel like you're dreaming, and sometimes that's a good thing. Sometimes it's nice to take a break from the ebbs and flows of life and simply dream.